Well, thank you so much for having me, for your interest in my talk today. We're going to focus on sort of the animal welfare benefits, but taking a more broader animal or one welfare approach. I'll introduce myself a little bit more. You may hear an accent. I'm originally from the Netherlands, where I did all my education and then moved to Virginia about 5 years ago. To work at Virginia Tech. My research and extension is focused on animal welfare, so my talk today is going to be heavily emphasizing the animal welfare aspect and benefits of agroforestry or silvopasture systems, but I will touch upon some of the other aspects, but keep in mind, animal welfare is my expertise, and I'm just trying to place it in a bigger framework or in the bigger One Welfare frame. So you probably have heard of One Health before. It's very much aligned with sustainable agriculture, right? We cannot just consider one aspect of animal production. We have to take into account the other aspects. One Welfare is probably a more sort of an adjustment from the One Health, in that it's a little broader. We recognize that animals, humans, and the environment are all interconnected. And health is just an aspect of animal welfare. Health is important, but other aspects are important too, like animals being able to express behaviors they're highly motivated to show, and how animals feel in their environment. So there's sort of three key aspects of animal welfare, and we can apply those aspects to the environment in a way, a little more difficult, but definitely to human welfare or human well-being. And today I'll show you how these silvopasture or agricultural systems can really fit in well with this sort of one welfare or one health approach. So the goal of good one welfare is that we have happy and healthy animals, so they feel good, they produce well, and they are able to show the behaviors they want to show. We want happy people, both producers and consumers, right? So we want a healthy product, but also a healthy income for the producers and some pride that comes with producing these animals, producing in this environment. And then we want a healthy environment, right? We want regenerative agriculture, so we want an environment that stays around for many years to come, and the silvopasture system can definitely contribute to that. So, as hopefully is clear now, I'm heavily going to focus on the animal welfare part, and then the other aspects I touch upon, but there's experts here in the room, or at least in this convergence, that have much more expertise on the human side or the environmental side, so bear with me on that. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the research project that Dane also highlighted, focusing on silvopasture for broiler chickens. I wanted to touch upon agroforestry and the avian flu. As producer or consumer, you must have heard that there is an avian flu outbreak going on right now that you either notice in supply chain issues or when you buy eggs and how expensive they are right now. So I wanted to talk about that for a little bit and then just have some very brief takeaways around focusing on animal welfare when you produce poultry. So first, the research project. This is also funded by SARE, but the Southern SARE, so it's a research and extension focused project where we were able to perform some experiments around pasture raising broiler chickens. We have a large-scale commercial producer involved where we planted the silvopasture and looking at the effects of giving them access to a silvopasture system. And then we looked at some animal welfare and production indicators at small-scale farms, 2 of which in Minnesota that I'll show some results from. Oh yeah, and then we're currently working on interviewing farmers, finding out about their experience with agroforestry and silvopastures, and then we'll also run some field days. So just a quick overview of the project team. It's not just me, we have a whole team of people who are helping making this project a success. So we have data collection sites. As I said, we ran experiments where we looked at the benefits of a silvopasture system, so giving birds tree ranging opportunities compared to a regular sort of open pasture, so grass pastures. If you think of commercial production, USDA organic production will require birds to have outdoor access. This is usually a sort of a regular grassy fields, not so much with a lot of vegetation there besides maybe grass. And what was mentioned this morning, chickens are descendants of the jungle fowl. They prefer canopy cover to range in, so there are some potential benefits there. Then we have that large-scale producer where we planted the silvopasture and then compared one flock with access to silvopasture and one flock without. And then our small-scale producers, one based in Virginia, where they had birds with access or without access to silvopasture, and two, for you all local farms, the Feed the People farm and the organic compound farm that contributed to this project also, where we collected some data on animal welfare and production outcomes. So just to show that we cannot really compare all these farms in that management is going to be different, the breeds or strain use are different, when we evaluated these animal welfare and production outcomes are different. So keep in mind that this is not a uniform sort of sample of farms that we can really scientifically compare. The only true scientific comparison is going to be in the experiments. The others are more like see what opportunities and potential benefits there are of using these type of systems. So on our experiments, we used the fast-growing broilers, right? The Cornish cross. The large-scale producer uses Cornish cross as a breed, and then our small-scale producers use a more slow-growing breed. So this is also important to take into account. So one important aspect of broiler chicken welfare is leg health and footpad health. So this is a measure that we've collected or focused on all these farms. And we focused on two indicators of leg health for these birds. One is footpad dermatitis. These are lesions on the footpads that sort of have a blackish appearance. They are associated mostly with litter quality or the bedding, and this could be outside as well. So it's the wetness of the bedding that they're housed on or they have access to can soften the skin and allow infection to occur, resulting in necrosis, so sort of cell death on the skin. And we can quantify this potential welfare concern using a categorical score, as you see here. So the score 0 is perfectly healthy feet, and then the worst case is score 4, where the lesions are very big, deep, and spread to the toes. So this is just some way to quantify footpad health for chickens. Then another measure that's important for, or in terms of leg health, is scoring lameness. There are some different scoring systems out there. There's different potential causes of lameness. It could be a bacterial infection. It's often associated with growth rate. So the fast-growing broilers are more sensitive for lameness than the slower-growing strains because they grow more quickly. And in this scoring system, it's a 0 to 2, where 0 is perfect gait, so the bird is not lame. A score 1 is you can see some awkward gait, but the bird can easily reach food and water and can walk distances. And then a score 2 means that the birds are unable to walk a long distance and have a clear impairment in their gait. So I'm going to show you some of the results per sort of section or per farm, and I'll give you a second to sort of orient. And I don't know if I have do I have a pointer? Laser? No, okay. So the scores that I showed you, the footpad dermatitis scores, remember a low score is healthy, good footpads. A high score is there's lesions on the feet that are associated with the sort of the bedding. In our Virginia Tech experiment, you can see the scores, the foot pad scores on the bottom of the graph, and then the amount or the proportion of birds on the vertical part of the graph. So for instance, the birds in the open grass pasture, so the sort of the conventional pasture, at least in large-scale commercial farms, about 75% of the birds had a score 0, which is pretty good. But in the Silvopasture system, we saw that 90% of the birds had healthy foot pads. So this tells us that foot pad health was improved in the Silvopasture birds compared to the open pasture birds, because more birds had healthy foot pads in the Silvopasture system compared to the open pastures. If we look at the large-scale producer, keep in mind these birds were a different age, and this is also just 2 flocks compared, so it's not like a scientifically sound comparison. But you can see that if we compare between our experiments and then the large-scale producer, you already see some differences, right? So you can see that more birds had higher scores. You can see that for instance, if you compare the score 1, you can see that 18 or 20% of the birds had a score 1, so that's a small lesion on the foot pad, compared to 18 or 9% in our experiments. And what I hopefully you also see is that there's not a big difference between those 2 flocks in terms of how the scores are distributed. Then our small-scale producers, we had that producer in Virginia where they had the open pasture access versus the Silvopasture access, so that's that open pasture versus Silvopasture, so the gray and the orange. Then we have the Minnesota farm with a relatively young Silvopasture, so that's the Silvopasture 5, about 5 years old, so not a lot of canopy cover just yet. And we have the farm that has much more developed canopy cover that's over 30 years old, so that's the Silvopasture 30. And here you can see that generally foot pads were quite healthy. So in especially the 3 Silvopasture categories, you see that the majority of those birds had a score 0, meaning their foot pads were perfectly healthy and no lesions were present. Only a few birds had a score 1, so that's a really small lesion. And even fewer had a score 2 or lower or higher, I mean. So this is a really good promising outcome, right? So we see that foot pad health really seems to benefit. So overall, we can conclude from this is that the birds had healthier foot pads when they had access to Silvopasture systems, especially based on the experiments that we did at Virginia Tech, and then just looking or observing the data that we have from the small-scale farms. A similar presentation of the results for the lameness score. So keep in mind, low score, perfect gait, high score means birds are lame. So again, quite good score. So the majority of our birds, regardless of treatment, had good gait, perfect gait. So that's quite surprising, especially for these fast-growing broilers that are so sensitive to issues with lameness. We really had an excellent outcome in these experiments in terms of lameness. If you look at the large-scale producer, you can see again that there's quite some difference. So we see that about 45% of the birds that we sampled in the open pasture had a score 1, meaning that there is already a clear abnormality in their gaits, but they are able to reach food and water relatively easily. And then compared to the Silvopasture group, where we saw 25% of these birds having a score 1. And just as an illustration, a score 2, at least in our lab, we would euthanize these birds because that's a painful condition. So seeing a score 2 is what you sort of never want to see in a flock. Then if we look at the small-scale producers, again, looks quite promising, like excellent scores. Most birds score 0, meaning they have perfect gait and are able to walk and without any abnormalities or awkwardness in their gaits. We saw a little bit worse gaits in those open pasture birds at the small scale producer in Virginia, but otherwise there wasn't really much difference. So our conclusions from these results was that really in the experiment and at the small scale producers, we see excellent gait in these birds, especially for those fast growers where you don't really expect a perfect gait. We did see that. And we saw some benefits of silvopasture at the large scale farm and the small scale farms compared to just having access to an open pasture. All right. Another sort of indicator that we like to use for animal welfare is looking at fear. Because fear is sort of an emotion, right, that we want to avoid in animals. We want to have a good human-animal relationship, especially if you consider when it's time for processing. You don't want these birds to be freaked out and panicking just because you enter the barn. You want them to be used to you, to be comfortable near humans. So measuring fear can be a good indicator of animal welfare. We can measure this with a tonic immobility test, which is kind of interesting because here we induce this sort of play dead response that chickens do. So you may have seen videos where chickens are hypnotized. Well, this is actually where you induce a fear response by pretending to be a predator. So in the scientific approach of this test is you put these birds on their back, like you can see in the picture, in a cradle, and put some gentle pressure on the sternum, and just wait for a while. So these birds may seem calm, but they're actually highly afraid. This play dead response is sort of a last resource for these birds to try not to get eaten. So you may see a bird freezing if there's an aerial predator, there's like a bird of prey. That could be the last way for them to try and avoid not get eaten, because if an animal's already dead, maybe it's diseased, so that's sort of a way to avoid predators. The longer these birds stay immobile, the more fearful they are, so the more of a fear response you've induced with this test. So keep in mind a higher bar, so longer duration is more fearful. If we compare the two treatments in the experiment, we see that the birds in the open pasture were more fearful than the birds in the silvopasture. So again, quite a promising result. Apparently having access to these trees, being able to range in an area that they prefer, because they are descendants of the jungle fowl, reduces some of this sort of innate fear that they have towards humans or predators. We see a similar and even starker difference at this large-scale farm where the birds in the open pasture system were much more fearful, so they stayed immobile for longer than the birds that had access to the silvopasture. In the small scale, or in the data from the small scale producers, we see a little bit of the opposite and more variety. So we saw actually that on some of the silvopasture farms, birds were a little bit more fearful compared to what we saw in our studies. Just based on these results, we saw that the birds in the open pasture, at least based on the experiments, were more fearful, so benefits for animal welfare to give them access to silvopastures. But we saw a range of responses in those small-scale farms, and that's probably in turn part of the breeds that are used. Some are more sensitive to human-animal interactions, and of course it plays a big role how you manage the bird. So if birds are extensively managed, they are not as used to human contact as maybe if they're more intensely managed. So allowing these birds to roam free away from humans could benefit as they are in their natural environment, but it could also mean that they're a little bit more fearful of humans when they are in forced contact. So it's a little bit of like weighing pros and cons in this case. So we can consider that other factors obviously also play a role related to the husbandry systems. Then the last animal welfare aspect I'm focusing on from the study is behavior, and more specifically ranging behavior, because we're providing them this range. We want them to use the range, right? We want them to roam out spread their feces around, not just stay near the house. We want them to use this opportunity that we provide them. So at the experimental side, we observed range use for 6 days during production. Keep in mind, these are those fast-growing broilers, so their range use is going to be very different from those slow-growing broilers. And we looked at the percentage of birds that were outside. So outside means that they're not in that sort of little coop that you can see in the pictures. So if we look at the range use, we overall saw more birds in the range in the silvopasture system compared to open pasture. So again, it sort of shows this is their preferred habitat. They want to be underneath trees or having some natural coverage to hide, and other research shows that too. Like, it's pretty consistent in that chickens will range more if they feel safety from this natural canopy. If we look at time of day, you can clearly see sort of the effect of how chicken behavior is naturally. They'll become active as the sun rises. They'll range, and you can see that almost regardless of the range type, most birds will be outside on pasture once the doors open, which was in this case around 8 a.m. So the majority of the flock will range in the morning, and then this decreases around midday and goes up again as the sun sets. So it's pretty much expected. But you do see a little bit more of a range use when birds had access to that silvopasture. This is sort of a video of one of the farms under the tree range system. It's a collection of pictures, actually. But it illustrates sort of this diurnal pattern of their ranging behavior. You'll see a lot of birds outside in the morning, and then as noon comes, birds will go inside. Let's see if it plays.
What breed chicken is that?
These are Royal Greys. So these are a slow-growing breed. All right, so I think it ran twice, but you can see that birds really enjoy sort of the access to the trees and will remain under them. And then most birds will go back inside around noon, which is the end of the video. All right, moving away a little bit from the animal welfare aspect and just touching upon the other aspects of the one welfare, one health approach. We want happy people, and this means we want producing animals. We want a healthy product. Here, I'm just going to show some numbers of productivity to show that it also matters. In these fast-growing broilers, we see bird live weight at day 41, so the day before they're actually processed, not differ between the treatments, which is also a good outcome, right? You don't want to see a reduction in productivity. Preferably, you want to see birds being more productive, but yeah, that's just not always the case. So no downsides to using a silvopasture system, but at least in our flocks, we also didn't see a clear benefit in terms of production outcomes. Then the carcass yield number, it's not full carcass, it's parts. So keep that in mind because it's almost half of the weight is gone. It's without the carcass. So this is legs, thighs, wings, and breast together. If we look at live bird weights of our small-scale producers, you can see they're relatively similar. Keep in mind, these are all different strains and all different ages, so we cannot really compare these numbers, but I did want to show you, just show you that productivity matters, and it can differ, but it's very dependent on the genetic strain or breed that's used, and obviously the age of the birds. Then the environmental impacts, as we are going, we're slowly moving further and further away from my expertise. So that's fun. We evaluated insect biodiversity. We used to have an entomologist on the project that would help us with this, but they moved on to their greener pastures in that moved away from research and took another job, and we had to sort of be a little creative with our biodiversity assessment. We focus on relative species abundance, so how much variation in species is there, and species richness, so how many species are actually there. We collected insects using pitfall traps and sticky traps, and then just sort of counted the species that were there. What we found was opposite of what we hoped to see, is where we saw a little improvement in insect biodiversity in the open pastures rather than in the silvopasture. So we saw a greater relative species abundance, meaning that there's more variation in species within the system or in the open pastures, and we saw more species in the open pastures compared to the silvopastures. But we didn't complete this sampling just yet, so these are just preliminary findings. We're still working on identifying the insects that we have collected, so it's just an early illustration of what could happen. Then we also measured some soil quality parameters. Not my specialty, I know. Today there's soil quality specialist here, so try to find them instead of me if you have questions about this. Here are some numbers. So we collected soil samples after the first experiment at the Virginia Tech site and after the second experiment at the Virginia Tech site. In between those experiments, beef cattle were able to graze the areas where the chickens were, so that can also impact some of these outcomes. If we just look at the difference between this open pasture and silvopasture, yes, we see differences for some of these measures. What that means, we'll ask the soil expert hopefully at some point, but we're looking at it. So going back to our sort of original focus, right? The one welfare, one health approach, the goal to have happy and healthy chickens. We did definitely find benefits of the silvopasture system compared to open pastures, especially in the experiments, but also when we look at just these different farms that apply the system. So we generally saw some reduced fear, we saw more healthier food pads, and we saw that birds range more when they have access to these trees. Yeah.
How do you know, and how do you conclude that a shorter time in the sleep position versus a longer time was reflective of less or more fear? How do you know which one is what?
Yeah, so that's a good question. That tonic immobility test has been validated like many years ago, and it's a very sort of common test, at least in research, to determine fear level. One way to, for instance, verify that that's actually the case is by doing an experiment where you gently handle chickens or roughly handle chickens and then see how they respond in that test. So with the rougher handling, you see that they stay in that immobile state for longer. So that's an indicator. We see that that's generally the response after any sort of procedure that we consider negative. So for instance, after transportation, they could be immobile for longer than before, for instance. So there's all these kinds of studies that are performed on that test that show that things that are clearly negative, like rough handling, right? We are pretty sure that that's not comfortable for any animal, result in these longer periods of time being immobile.
Another question, if I may. So in the injuries on the feet,
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain what is the relevance? So why is that an indicator of health?
Okay, so that is a good point also. So thank you for asking that. So the foot pad dermatitis is an indicator of health or foot pad health because it's a lesion, right? It's a wound. Birds that are housed on more wet litter or litter with more chemicals present will develop these lesions. And it's a gateway for other infections to occur. So the skin is affected. There's a lesion. Bacteria can enter that lesion and then like spread through the blood. So it's a gateway for secondary infections. But also these lesions cause pain. Like imagine if you have a blister on your foot, that's painful to walk. And we know that birds that have a lesion score that's 3 or higher, so that was already pretty high compared to what we found in our research, birds are experiencing pain. And one way you can study that is give them pain medication like Tylenol in their water and see if their behavior changes, or give them the option to drink that Tylenol water versus regular water, and they'll start preferring the Tylenol water because it does reduce the pain that they experience on their feet. So it's for the bird's experience negative when lesions are severe, but then also a potential for diseases and infection to enter and then generally affect the bird's health indirectly. Does that answer your question?
It was more about the context, because as farmers we want to know, why does something matter? Measuring something could be measured well, but to what end? And the end here is the animal behavior is critical, because if they are not ranging, if they are not healthy, so many other things go wrong. Including the feed, their ability to do so many things that we want them doing. And the feed is what takes them to places.
Yeah. Yeah, so footpad dermatitis is one important measure, lameness is the other, because they rely as us a lot on their legs and on their feet. So for a healthy, happy bird, we need healthy legs and feet.
I have one question around around fear, like measuring fear. You mentioned that sort of this mobility response is one way. Is there any connection between looking at like aggression in flocks and connecting that with fear, or are there any studies connecting those?
I know for laying hens, for instance, because aggression is a little bit more of an issue there than with broiler chickens. Broiler chickens are generally a little bit more docile and more social. Fear and aggression are related in that some genetic breeds or some strains can be more sensitive to both. So you have more flighty genetic strains, and they'll also be more fearful towards humans. So there is an association with broilers. I'm not sure if that's either studied or as such big of a problem, just because aggression is not that common in those birds.
Building up on the point you made, Vicky, I wonder, did you see a connection between birds who had scored high on the foot side and the lameness and production? Like the more
Sure, yeah.
injured they are, the less they produce.
Yeah, so the question is there an association between those foot pads, the lameness, the walking ability, and how they produce? So we weren't able to evaluate that association just because, especially with the gait, the lameness scores, most birds scored perfectly. So if all birds have perfect gait, you cannot really find an association. But it is a really good point, and I would say in general, yes, you can find birds with higher severity of those foot pads issues. It can induce lameness because it hurts, right? So they'll start walking less and it hurts to walk. They'll also produce less because they'll be less likely to move towards the feed or walk to the water, so their intake will reduce. But it's a little tricky because often footpad dermatitis and lameness is associated with high body weight. So heavier birds generally are more sensitive to this problem. So it's a tricky association, but a good point.
Yeah, and one more question on the footpad health. At what age did you do the score?
So the question is, what age did we score the footpad dermatitis for? In our experiments, we scored these birds at about 39, 40 days, so towards end of production for fast-growing broilers. For these slow-growing broilers, they were about 65 to 70-something days of age. So we tried to target sort of end of life because that's where the lesions would probably be most severe.
I have one more question around the insect piece of this, because I was surprised too that you guys are getting like kind of the flip of what you'd expect. open pasture system, and so maybe you're getting more, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Or are the chickens eating more of us?
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is the difference in insect biodiversity, is it related to environmental factors like wind, or maybe because the chickens eat the insects? And well, let's hope it's the second thing, right? Where we see that these birds, because they range more in the silvopasture, maybe interact more with the insects around and may eat them. We haven't evaluated their stomach content. We opened up one bird and we saw that there's a lot of grass in there, so they definitely forage. We haven't looked at the insect content, but yeah, those factors could play a role.
Did you, kind of along that line, see a difference or look at difference of amount of feed eaten? So conversion of feed to the same weight at the end.
Yeah, so the question is does feed conversion differ between the treatments? Very important aspect. We did try, but we were unable to quantify that, but that is a good point because they range more, they probably forage more, and potentially that would benefit if feed costs are reduced. I don't have that answer for you, unfortunately, but good point. All right, on that we'll move forward because there is some other stuff that I wanted to cover before we run out of time. So summary, still, yes, we see some benefits for animals, maybe some benefits or at least no disadvantages for people, but we saw this very interesting visualization from the student earlier this morning, Anna, who has much more insights in sort of the human aspect and human welfare aspect of this production system. And we need more work in our project, but maybe also in other projects to look at sort of the environmental benefits. But theory is promising, some results are promising, and we'll just keep working on this. Moving on to a different topic, hot topic you could say, because this avian flu outbreak is currently underway. Started, I think, January of last year, so we're a bit over a year now of this avian flu outbreak, and it's actually, or really problematic because it's a high pathogenic version of the avian flu, meaning that it impacts humans but also the animals. So these are numbers from the USDA that I got from their website this month, so they're up to date. We see that about 322 commercial flocks, so large-scale flocks, are impacted. About 482 backyard flocks, so it's not just a commercial large-scale problem, it's also small-scale farms or producers or even like hobby farmers that are impacted. And about 58 million birds are impacted, meaning they were confirmed to be infected with this high-path avian flu and had to be killed because of it. So these birds are all killed because they had the infection. Just looking at their website, I saw the last reported case in Minnesota was in December, so that's promising, right? That's 3 months ago, so maybe you'll all be sort of saved from any further outbreak, but it's still important to focus on the impacts. Some signs to look out for in your birds. Fever. Fever is the first indicator about 24 hours before any other clinical signs occur. So do with that what you will. You could potentially record body temperature of your birds maybe regularly if you think there may be an infection brewing. Some other more clearer signs are like swelling or discoloration of the head or the wattles. Respiratory responses like coughing, sneezing, discharge from the nasal openings. Lack of coordination, inactivity. So if you see birds that are very passive, not really responsive when you enter the barn or when you enter the pasture, that could be a sign that the bird's not feeling well. Sick birds will hide. So if you see birds hiding under the feeder, for instance, if you have hanging feeders, that could be a sign that it's sick. You can see diarrhea, so take a look at the fecal material when you evaluate your flock and get familiar with what normal feces looks like compared to abnormal feces, just to get used to looking at bird health that way. if you do have laying hens, which I think none of you or maybe one of you does, a reduction in egg production will occur, and it's a highly pathogenic strain of this virus, meaning that over 75% of the flock will die from this if they are infected. It's also important to note that if you do have avian influenza in your flock, you are required by law to report it to states or other government officials. You have to report this disease. So avian influenza is generally transmitted from wild birds. Especially migratory water birds are the sort of the high-risk species here. For instance, geese, ducks, swans, seagulls, or lapwings. I don't know if you have those here or not, but these migratory water birds are your main sort of worry when you consider avian influenza. There are also some low-risk species, so birds of prey and scavengers. They are low risk because they're unlikely to be infected. They're unlikely to get sick or die if they have infection. And they're unlikely to sort of transmit the disease, but they can get it if they interact with birds that are infected with avian flu. So there's not no risk, there's just much lower risk compared to the other birds. It's still unclear if like pests play a role, think pigeons, rats, mice. So it's really focusing on those migratory water birds, and if you have a farm, you could consider trying to discourage them from entering your area. I could find no, besides one study that looked at sort of free-ranging systems and especially agroforestry with, in terms of avian influenza, but I did find one, so I'll show those results. This is a study that was performed in the Netherlands by Monique Besman and her colleagues, and they evaluated laying hen farms with a ranging amount or a different amount of canopy cover. So they included farms with no canopy cover, so that's just open grassland range, and farms with about 90% canopy cover, so that's really sort of a forested area. They performed live observations of wild birds, so just recording which birds access the farms that they included, and distinguish between those high-risk and low-risk species. So what did they find? They find that there were more high-risk species in the spring than any other season, especially compared to the fall and the winter. So discouraging birds to enter your farm in the spring could be most highly impactful in terms of potential risk of transmission. They found, which is very promising for all of us, is that they found more high-risk birds in pastures that had very little canopy cover. So open pastures will attract those migratory water birds, while pastures with canopy cover, and in their study it was anything over 5% canopy cover, will sort of reduce the risk of those birds coming to your farm. So that's very promising. They also looked at the farm surroundings, the pasture surroundings, so not the pasture itself, but the area around it, whether it was vegetated with trees or not. And they found that there were more high-risk birds when the area was open compared to half open. Those were the only options. So again, having trees, having woody vegetation in the area where your birds range seems like a good way to reduce risk of these high-risk birds to come to your farm. They didn't really see any relationship between those low-risk species, so those birds of prey and scavenging birds, and any association, so nothing we can really conclude from that. So what were their findings? They mostly found ducks and geese accessing those open pasture farms. Why? Because they prefer short grass to forage on, and they're a prey species, so they need this open space to feel safe so that there's no predators hiding in the bushes. Also, they usually travel in large groups, so they need a lot of space for the whole flock of geese to be able to land and forage there. So keep open spaces small, will reduce the chance of ducks and geese to enter your farm. It looks like the presence of woody vegetation reduces some of the risk of these birds coming to your farm and foraging there. But this was quite a small study, so we cannot generalize all these results just yet. There's some promise there. We need to look into this more and find out whether what they found is replicable, for instance, in the US, because this was just in the Netherlands. But as I said, it looks promising. All right, and then my final sort of topic for today is some general animal welfare considerations when you farm poultry. One aspect that I sort of touched upon was that chickens have certain behavioral needs. Behavioral needs are behaviors that they're highly motivated to express, so chickens will work hard to be able to express these emotions. You can test that, like how much of a weight are they willing to push, how much of a challenge are they willing to take to have access to an elevated perching space, for instance. Chickens want to rest in an elevated space. They want to be on a perch at night, sometimes during the day as well. So giving them this elevated space fulfills some of those behavioral needs to perch. They feel safer when they can perch. Dust bathing is another highly motivated behavior. It's sort of their way to shower, so they clean their feathers, maintain their plumage by bathing in friable litter. So having any access to a dry, friable litter will fulfill this need. And they're a social species. You should never keep a chicken on its own. They want a flock, and housing them that way benefits their welfare. What is nice is that these needs are generally fulfilled in our sort of tree ranging system, right? They can perch, at least the farms that I access, there were perches there for these birds to rest on elevated spaces. They have friable material, at least inside, to perform that dust bathing behavior. They can forage outside in the range, and they're housed as a flock, so that's sort of basic, right? So they have all these needs potentially fulfilled. There's some risks for health, thus for welfare in any poultry production, but also with this sort of free-range, tree-range system. Obviously, having birds or giving birds access to the outdoors could increase risk of disease because they are exposed to other animals, right? They're not housed indoor only in a very biosecure area. They have this outdoor space. So giving them a free range could potentially increase some of this disease risk. So be cognizant of that. It's also a little harder to detect disease if the birds are ranging in this sort of scrubby area. Can you identify that sick bird? So it can be a little more challenging to detect disease early. Footbed dermatitis, lameness, we already talked about that. Fear, we talked about that. So these are not specific to free-ranging birds. There are risks anywhere when you raise broiler chickens or any chickens. Birds are at risk of parasites. So again, look at the fecal material, look at the defecation of the birds to sort of familiarize yourself with what normal, healthy feces looks like so that you know when it turns abnormal. Ectoparasites like lice, mites, bedbugs even can infest these birds. So periodically picking up some birds, looking in their feathers, looking at their skin will be very helpful to just make sure that you don't have something brewing, and detecting these issues early will help a sort of a widespread outbreak if you do see it. Then the last point, thermal comfort or thermal distress, sort of a health welfare risk, because chickens are kind of sensitive to both heat and cold, depending on their age. So giving them the opportunity to find warmer areas to go inside if it is cold outside can be beneficial, making sure that the environment is warm when they're still young and only have down and not their full feathers yet benefits them. And of course, access to trees or shrubs provides them with a sort of a milder microclimate. It's a little less warm, a little less windy, a little less exposed to rain. So all those things will benefit the bird. So again, a potential benefit of this system for birds. if you do have a health concern or a welfare concern, at some point you're going to have to make the decision, am I going to treat this animal? Is it worth treating it, or am I going to euthanize it? And euthanasia, just to put the definition out there, is killing the animal for its own benefit. It's literally a good death. So we want to make sure that the death is humane, but we're ending its life for the animal's benefit, either to end its current suffering or end potential future suffering. And there's two sort of decision trees that could make this decision a little bit more helpful or guided. If the bird is able to reach food and water on its own, so think about that leg health again, stand and walk on its own, and able to potentially recover if you do treat it, that's depending on whatever issue is going on. If the answer is yes, monitor the bird, maybe put it in a hospital pen, like separate it from the flock with some other birds, because you shouldn't keep a bird on its own, and monitor its health and see if it can actually recover from whatever it's ailing. If the answer is no, it is in the animal's best interest to euthanize. If you see a bird that's losing weight, especially broiler chickens, they should really never lose weight. So if you see weight loss, that's a sign something's wrong. If you see it in poor condition, very inactive, sign that something's wrong. If the bird's in pain or distress, these are moments where you can then consider euthanasia. Unless you can treat the bird again, then, as I said, separate them, making sure that you provide the good treatment and keep monitoring. When you perform euthanasia, consider animal welfare again, so gentle handling and restraint. We want to make it as least distressing as possible, so we want to make sure that the animal loses sensibility, so loses consciousness quick and as painless as possible. But we also want them to remain unconscious. So while the animal is dying, for instance, if you perform cervical dislocation where you break the neck, you don't want this bird to regain consciousness and be alert while it's sort of dying. So it's always recommended to first stun the bird and then kill it or euthanize it so that the bird is experiencing the least amount of pain and distress. I put some resources on the slide. I'm not sure if people can access those. I'm happy to share them in the app as well. Is there a question?
Yeah. I'm just wondering about if I find a sick bird in my flock, and it comes down to euthanizing it, does it have to be humane? That's the bird's end of the bird's life, but it's not going to be eaten.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's disease.
Mm-hmm.
So should I still go through the trouble of making sure it has a calm death?
So the question is, when you consider euthanasia, bird is sick, it's clearly not healthy, do you have to provide it a humane death? I think our responsibility as owners of these animals and growing these animals, yes, I would try to give them a humane end of life as you provide them a humane life while they're still healthy. So consider that if this animal is already uncomfortable from whatever disease or whatever it's ailing, you probably don't want to add to that suffering, even if it's just for a few minutes. You probably want to make sure that it is as painless and stress-free as possible, just from, a good stewardship perspective. We want to treat these animals well until the last second of their lives. So, but yeah, good question. You also want to make sure that the animal is actually dead, and you can do that by assessing its reflexes or confirming brain death. If you have euthanized an animal, if it's vocalizing or blinking, it's not dead yet. So you definitely want to follow up with maybe a different euthanasia methods, if you can. If you touch the animal's neck and it feels tense, the animal's not dead, and it's probably still conscious. So these are some indicators or sort of tests you can do to make sure that the animal's actually dead. Another one that's very useful is sort of poking the eye gently. If you feel the third eyelid, the corneal reflex upon your finger, that's a sign that the animal is not dead yet. So these are some indicators to make sure that the animal's suffering is not prolonged, it's not experiencing a slow and painful death, but actually is gone. So if you see any of these indicators, then you want to follow up and kill it again, basically. So to end on a positive note, some pictures of people and chickens. And if you take anything away from my talk today, I would like you to take that this using silvopasture agriculture or agroforestry approaches for broiler chickens, yes, it can definitely benefit the sort of the one welfare approach where birds are benefited, people can benefit, and the environment can benefit, although, as I said, in my research, we mostly focus on the birds. And with that, I would like to thank you. Yeah, sorry.